The last night didn't feel unfinished. There were plans still open, a place she was expected to be. Nothing suggested it would end with questions. At some point the routine broke. Not loudly, not in a way that forced anyone to stop. But by morning the silence was already too heavy to ignore. No alarms, no immediate panic, just the assumption that the night would explain itself. Her name was Shil Danishevsky. Shil was expected to be seen again, expected to respond, expected to arrive where she said she would. Nothing about that night suggested it would interrupt everything. When she didn't show up, concern didn't arrive all at once. Came slowly, hidden inside waiting and familiar excuses. Everyone assumed there was a reason. Everyone assumed there was time. Most people expect situations like this to resolve quickly. A simple explanation. That's not what happened. The place Shil was last expected to be wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It was an ordinary space. The kind people trust because it feels familiar. Hours passed. Then another day. And with every delay, the story people told themselves became harder to defend. The people closest to Shil were already part of the picture, close enough to explain the plans, close enough to shape the first explanations. At this point, most people expect clarity, a reason that makes sense. What came instead was uncertainty. Investigators would focus on places tied to routine, not danger. Spaces meant to be passed through, not feared. Timing mattered here. Messages mattered. And what was missing would become just as important as what was known. To understand what happened to Shil Danishevsky, you have to look closely at the moment the routine broke, and the silence that followed. Shil Danishevsky was a wife, a mother, a woman deeply embedded in the routines of family life. Her days revolved around her children, her home, and the tight-knit religious community she belonged to. Friends described her as attentive and devoted, someone whose world was structured around responsibility and care. There was nothing reckless about her life. She was not known for impulsive behavior. She did not disappear without explanation. Her mornings followed patterns. Her apartment, by all accounts, was orderly, predictable. That normalcy would later become one of the most unsettling elements of the case. Shil lived in the apartment with her husband, Daniel Kovlin, and their children. On the surface, the family appeared stable, financially secure, well established in their neighborhood. There were no emergency calls from the apartment that morning. No frantic reports of an accident in progress. What investigators initially saw was a scene that seemed to explain itself. A bathtub, water, and an unfortunate fall. At the family's request, no autopsy was performed. Religious objections were cited. The medical examiner accepted the explanation. The death certificate listed the cause as accidental drowning. Within hours, the apartment was returned to the family, and the moment passed. But time has a way of reopening doors that were closed too quickly. Years later, details that once seemed insignificant would begin to stand out. Small inconsistencies, decisions made too fast, questions never asked. Why was there no autopsy in a case involving a young mother? Why was the scene not preserved? Why were certain injuries, later described by prosecutors, not documented at the time? These questions did not emerge all at once. They surfaced slowly, quietly, persistently. For nearly a decade, Shil Danishevsky's death remained classified as an accident. Life moved forward. Her children grew older. The story faded from public view, until it didn't. In 2018, prosecutors would announce that they believed Shil's death was not an accident at all, but a homicide hidden in plain sight. They would allege that the bathroom scene had been staged, and that the truth had been buried beneath assumptions. deference, and time. And suddenly, a death once written off as tragic misfortune would become something far more disturbing. The question was no longer how did she fall, but what had been missed and why. To understand why Shiel Danishevsky's death would later be re-examined, investigators had to move backward, away from the bathtub, away from the paperwork, and into the structure of her life. That meant looking closely at her marriage. Shiel was married to Daniel Kovlin, a respected figure within their Orthodox Jewish community. He was educated, financially stable, and outwardly attentive. From the outside, the marriage appeared traditional and orderly. There were no public accusations, no police reports, no visible signs of instability that would have raised immediate alarms, at least not on the surface. Behind closed doors, prosecutors would later allege, the relationship was far more complicated. Court filings described marital conflict that had not been disclosed at the time of Shiel's death. According to later investigative findings, the marriage had been under strain for years. Disputes over finances, control, and personal autonomy were said to be ongoing, though largely invisible to outsiders. This was not a volatile household in the obvious sense. There were no screaming matches spilling into the hallway. No neighbors calling police in the middle of the night. The tension, if it existed, was quieter. That quiet tension mattered. Because in cases where a death is initially ruled accidental, investigators often ask one foundational question: who had access? Who was present? Who stood to benefit from the conclusion that nothing criminal had occurred? In Shiel's case, the answer was unavoidable. Her husband was in the apartment. Her husband was the first adult present. Her husband had immediate access to the scene. That alone did not prove wrongdoing, but it framed every later question. At the time of Shiel's death, Daniel Kovlin reported discovering her unresponsive in the bathtub. Emergency services were contacted. The scene was assessed briefly. With no obvious signs of trauma documented and an explanation readily available, authorities moved quickly toward closure. That speed would later draw scrutiny. Why was there no deeper inquiry? Why was the possibility of foul play dismissed so early? And why were standard procedures, like an autopsy, never initiated independently? Prosecutors would later argue that context had been mistaken for clarity, because the family was respected, because religious objections were honored, because the scene appeared calm. Those factors combined to reduce friction, to smooth over doubt. Years later, when the case was reopened, investigators revisited not only the physical evidence, but the patterns of behavior surrounding Shiel's death. They examined phone records. They reviewed financial documents. They interviewed people who had known the couple privately. What emerged was not a dramatic revelation, but a collection of small, unsettling details that did not align neatly with the original narrative. The bathroom scene, prosecutors would claim, was too clean. The timeline was too convenient. And the explanation relied heavily on assumptions rather than verification. Still, uncertainty remained. There were no witnesses to a crime. No preserved physical evidence from the day itself. No autopsy to confirm cause of death. The passage of time had erased much of what might have been examined, which left investigators facing a difficult reality. If Shiel Danishevsky had been killed, the opportunity to prove it conclusively had been compromised from the very beginning. And yet, prosecutors believed the remaining evidence was enough to move forward. The question was whether the court would agree, or whether the case had been reopened too late to survive legal scrutiny. When prosecutors reopened the case years later, they were not starting with a fresh crime scene. They were starting with absence. No preserved bathroom. No photographs taken with homicide in mind. No autopsy report documenting injuries in detail. What they had instead was a record of decisions, what had been done and what had not. Investigators returned to the original reports from December 31, 2009. The documentation was thin. The responding officers described a woman found unresponsive in a bathtub, water present, no signs of forced entry, and no visible evidence of a struggle recorded at the time. The medical examiner accepted the explanation of an accidental drowning. The cause of death was listed accordingly. The scene was never treated as a potential homicide. That classification shaped everything that followed. Years later, prosecutors would argue that the initial assessment relied too heavily on appearance. They pointed to the lack of detailed injury documentation. They questioned why bruising and other physical indicators, later referenced by the prosecution, were not thoroughly examined or recorded. They raised concerns about how quickly the apartment was released back to the family. In homicide investigations, time preserves truth. In this case, time erased it. As part of the renewed inquiry, investigators conducted a forensic reanalysis based on available records, photographs, and expert review. Specialists examined what could still be evaluated: the mechanics of accidental bathtub drownings, the likelihood of certain injuries occurring from a slip and fall, and whether the original narrative adequately explained the circumstances described. Their conclusions did not align cleanly with the accident theory. Prosecutors alleged that the bathroom scene showed signs of staging, elements that suggested the environment may have been arranged to resemble an accident rather than reflect what actually occurred. Without an autopsy, much of the case rested on interpretation rather than direct measurement. That limitation became both the prosecution's challenge and its central argument. They contended that the absence of an autopsy was not neutral, it was consequential, that a critical opportunity to establish cause and manner of death had been lost, leaving behind uncertainty that favored whoever benefited most from the ruling of an accident. Investigators also reviewed marital history and financial context. They examined disputes documented years after the fact. They looked at communications and behavior patterns in the period leading up to Shields' death. Prosecutors alleged that these elements, when viewed together, pointed to motive and opportunity. Again, the case was built not on a single piece of evidence, but on accumulation. The defense countered that the passage of time had distorted memory, interpretation, and intent. They argued that conclusions were being drawn from incomplete data, that what prosecutors described as staging could just as easily be normal household conditions misread through the lens of hindsight. They emphasized what could not be proven: no autopsy, no preserved physical evidence, no contemporaneous documentation of a crime. As the case moved toward trial, the court was faced with a fundamental question. Could a jury be asked to determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a case where the most critical forensic step had never been taken? The answer would hinge not only on what investigators believed, but on what the law would allow them to present. And as pre-trial hearings progressed, that question became decisive. Because before a jury could weigh the evidence, the judge would have to decide whether key portions of it could be heard at all. In 2018, nearly 9 years after Shields Danishevsky was found dead in her New York City apartment, prosecutors formally charged her husband, Daniel Kovlin, with second-degree murder. The announcement was seismic. A death that had been classified as an accident, quietly, quickly, and without an autopsy, was now being reframed as an alleged homicide. The reopening of the case drew national attention, not because of a single new discovery, but because of what many believed had been missing from the very beginning. For nearly a decade, the official record had remained unchanged. Shields Danishevsky's death was listed as an accidental drowning following a slip and fall in the family bathtub. The determination was made within hours. No autopsy was performed. The scene was not preserved for extended forensic analysis. That decision shaped everything that followed. When prosecutors revisited the case years later, they did so with the weight of hindsight, and with a recognition that early certainty may have closed doors that could never be reopened. The prosecution's case rested not on new physical evidence, but on reinterpretation. They argued that the original conclusion of accidental drowning had been premature, that injuries later identified through expert review were inconsistent with a simple fall, that the bathroom scene, when analyzed retrospectively, showed indicators of staging rather than chance, and that the absence of an autopsy had prevented the truth from being fully examined at the moment it mattered most. But the same absence that fueled suspicion also created a legal fault line. Because courts do not operate on suspicion, they operate on admissible evidence. As the case moved through pretrial proceedings, defense attorneys focused on that gap. They challenged the admissibility of expert opinions formed years after the fact. They argued that conclusions drawn without contemporaneous forensic documentation were inherently speculative, that opinions offered long after the scene had been altered or lost could not reliably substitute for evidence preserved in real time. In their view, prosecutors were asking the court to bridge evidentiary gaps with inference. The judge agreed. In 2023, after extensive legal argument, the court ruled that crucial elements of the prosecution's case were inadmissible. Without those elements, the case could not meet the standard required to proceed to trial. The charges against Daniel Kovlin were dismissed. He was released from custody. The ruling did not determine what happened in the bathroom that morning in December 2009. It determined only that the case, as presented, could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction matters, because dismissal is not exoneration, and suspicion is not conviction. The legal system is built on preservation of scenes, of evidence, of timelines. When those foundations are compromised, even the most serious allegations can become impossible to adjudicate. For Sheil Danishevsky's family and her children, the outcome offered no closure. The original ruling of accidental death remained intact. The later allegations remained unresolved. Two narratives now existed side by side, neither able to fully displace the other. What remained undeniable was the cost of early certainty. Sheil Danishevsky was a mother whose death was decided quickly, quietly, and without the full weight of forensic scrutiny. Whether that decision concealed a crime or reflected tragic misjudgment may never be known. But the consequences of that decision are clear. The case has since become a cautionary example within the legal and investigative community, a reminder of what happens when assumptions replace investigation, when deference replaces verification, when time is allowed to close questions instead of answering them. Her story does not end with a verdict. It ends with a lesson that unexplained deaths demand rigor, even when answers feel obvious, that scenes deserve preservation, even when families seek privacy, and that once evidence is lost, no amount of later certainty can bring it back. For Sheil Danishevsky, the truth remains legally unresolved, but her case continues to shape how future deaths are questioned, and sometimes that legacy is all that remains. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We post crime case videos nightly. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.